Get things started. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Daly, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders. And on behalf of the NFOSD and in collaboration with the Thyroid, Head and Neck Cancer Foundation, we appreciate your interest in learning about our major upcoming advocacy initiative. I'd like to take a quick second here to introduce you to Erica Rauscher and Jesse Fisher from the THANC Foundation. We couldn't plan this meeting without their tremendous help, so thank you both for being here. We are incredibly excited to share an important opportunity with you, the upcoming externally led patient-focused drug development, or EL-PFDD meeting, focused on dysphagia. This is a rare and meaningful chance for you to speak directly to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and other key stakeholders who shape the future of treatment options. This is your moment to make your voice heard. It doesn't matter where you are located or where you are in your journey with dysphagia. What matters most is your story. The goal of this meeting is simple yet powerful: to hear directly from patients and caregivers about what it's like to live with dysphagia and what your experiences have been with current treatments. This matters, and it matters because your stories have the power to improve drug and treatment development and shape the way regulatory decisions are made about the future treatments for dysphagia. This is a one-time, impactful opportunity to drive change, and we hope that you will join us, and we hope that you will speak up. Before we go any further, we want to take a moment to express our gratitude to our sponsors, our supporters, and our partners. This important event wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our financial sponsors who have helped make this meeting a reality. Their investment in the dysphagia community is paving the way for meaningful change. We also want to thank our supporters, organizations who have shared this initiative, lifted up the voices of those impacted by dysphagia, and encouraged participation within their communities. And a very special thank you as well to our nonprofit partners. Your collaboration, passion, and commitment to patient advocacy have helped us reach more people, amplify more voices, and strengthen the impact of this meeting. So to each of you, thank you for standing with us in the dysphagia community. And before we dive in here, I want to go over just a few housekeeping notes with you. Today's webinar is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour. To help everything run smoothly, we ask that you keep yourself muted and type in any questions or comments that you might have into the Q&A box in the toolbar. Recognizing that many within our community also have difficulty with their speech in addition to their swallowing, I will be moderating the Q&A session at the end. We are recording this, so if you would like to revisit any of the content presented or share it with others, it will be available on our website within the next 48 hours. And just some information here for you. The EL-PFDD meeting has a powerful purpose. This meeting serves to educate the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and other key stakeholders about the realities of living with dysphagia. We want to hear directly from you about what it's like to live with dysphagia, how it impacts your daily life, the physical, emotional, and social impacts. We want to know how you or your loved ones are currently managing this condition, and we want to know what a meaningful treatment would look like from your perspective. By participating in this meeting, you are helping the FDA and others involved in research and healthcare and industry understand what it's really like to live with dysphagia. And while this will be covered in more detail here in the coming hour, this meeting is your chance to directly inform the FDA's decisions and help ensure that the patient perspective is front and center in the development of these future therapies. For too long, the patient voice has been missing from the drug and treatment development process. Historically, patients and caregivers were brought in late to this process after a drug was already in development, or sometimes only when a clinical trial was failing or companies or the FDA needed help in understanding why. But that's changing. Today, the FDA recognizes that meaningful treatments must reflect what truly matters to you, which is why they've established these patient-focused drug development meetings to actively engage patients and their caregivers at the very beginning of the process, as well as throughout. This meeting is part of that shift. Your lived experience helps the FDA understand the real-world impact of dysphagia. What symptoms are most burdensome to you? What trade-offs are you willing or not willing to make? And what would meaningful progress look like to you? Stakeholder engagement is now an FDA priority, and that means that your voice is not only invited, it's essential. And now I would like to welcome James Valentine and Sarah Wicks from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, or HPM, who are experts in drug development and FDA review. James has worked the last 17 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. James previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison, helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There, he helped to develop and launch the patient-focused drug development initiative. Sarah is a regulatory attorney who has spent her career helping drug developers and patient organizations navigate novel and complex regulatory issues. She is especially passionate about ensuring the patient voice is meaningfully incorporated throughout the drug development process. James, Sarah, and the HPM team have worked with many patient organizations to ensure their community voices were heard by decision makers. Relevant to our meeting today, they have helped plan and moderate over 70 EL-PFDD meetings, including one in which the NFOSD and the THANC Foundation were involved in on xerostomia. So we know already that we are in good hands with James and Sarah. And with that, I would like to turn the presentation over to them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And it's such a pleasure here this afternoon to be with the dysphagia community and talk to you about this important opportunity to have your voices heard by the FDA, by drug developers, and other important stakeholders. What we hope to cover with you today is a little bit of information that will help you in considering your participation for the meeting, whether you're someone that's here because you know you already want to attend the EL-PFDD meeting, or perhaps you're wondering if this is the right type of opportunity for you. In either case, we hope that you'll, after this presentation, feel a lot more comfortable in understanding what this meeting is about, and also really what the FDA is all about. For some of this, that may be a little bit of a refresher, but it's, I think, always important to understand the audience and the process that we're trying to inform when we're putting on these types of efforts. So today we'll cover some information for you. We'll give you some background about the FDA and the drug development process. After that, we'll actually then talk to you about where your voice as patients and caregivers of people living with dysphagia fit into that drug development process, diving deeper then into actually giving you an overview of the EL-PFDD meeting itself, and really getting into some of the real nuts and bolts, about logistics and the format and how you can participate. So we're kind of starting high level, and we'll work our way down into the details, and we will save time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions as we move through these slides. So I'll kick us off here, give you some background about FDA and drug development. And where we really want to start is with drug development itself, because I think it's important to know a bit about this process, because there's different points during this process where understanding patients' experiences and your preferences and priorities for treatments is really important. And so drug development really starts before we even have a drug, in what's called the drug discovery phase. Researchers are discovering new drugs. They're conducting basic science research to understand the disease process, trying to see if we can understand that, where we might be able to intervene, maybe help relieve symptoms, maybe even be able to help reverse some of the effects of the disease or condition. And so by understanding the kind of underlying biology, that allows us to then start to test different compounds to see if those different compounds might have beneficial effects at different points in the biological process of the disease. And so this can be either through existing treatments, sometimes referred to as repurposing, where different treatments, even though they might already be approved or in development for other conditions, might also have effects that are relevant to your condition. Or as medical science and advances occur, there's new technologies that allow us to maybe even in more targeted ways try to impact that disease process. Whichever it is, though, once the researchers identify a promising compound, then we move into what we call more of the development of the drug. And there's a well-established path that we'll talk about in terms of what that looks like to make sure that the drugs are safe and effective by the time that they are through development and will reach the public once they're approved and on the market. So what you see here on the bottom of this slide are the different phases of drug development. We'll be working through those. So now remember, we now have a drug compound that we're starting to develop. And so before we ever start developing or testing a product in people, we do preclinical development. And so this is where we're, testing the compound in animals primarily, but other preclinical types of tests, laboratory tests. I kind of think of it even as like petri dish type testing, where we're looking to see first, is it safe for initial use in humans? Those are called toxicology studies. When we're also looking to see if it's sufficiently effective against a disease target. And that can be either using different chemical assay tests or even animal models of a disease. So there might be animal models of dysphagia where we can see if the compound has some effect in helping treat the dysphagia in that animal model. And so these two things are really critical to help us not only see if the product overall is reasonably safe and has, we have confidence that it might actually work, but we also are looking to see which dose or dosing regimen might be the right balance in terms of being safe, reasonably safe and sufficiently effective. Because no drug is 100% safe, so it's really you want to find the right dose that can find that right balance. Once these preclinical studies are complete, then that information is provided to FDA in what's called an investigational new drug application, or an IND. This is the application that allows a drug developer to take the compound then into clinical trials. And so the first of those clinical trials is called phase 1, when FDA is looking at that first in human clinical trial proposal. They're looking at those pharmacology and toxicology studies. That's those preclinical studies of whether the drugs has evidence of efficacy, whether it's reasonably safe. They're also looking at another important prong, which is the product's quality, manufacturing information. It doesn't do us any good if we have a molecule that might be safe and effective if it's not being manufactured in a consistent way, where we know if people that are taking the drug actually get the right dose, and that there aren't harmful impurities, perhaps, as part of the manufacturing process that could be harmful to people. And so FDA looks at that information as kind of the third prongs. So you have like safety, efficacy, and quality. FDA is, of course, also looking at the clinical protocol itself and other information that would be provided to investigators, which are the study doctors. And they ultimately decide whether to allow that clinical trial to proceed or not. These first clinical trials, these phase 1 studies, these can either be in healthy volunteers, but oftentimes can start directly in patients, people living with a particular condition. These studies are short, sometimes starting with just single doses, working their way up from lower doses to higher, and then moving to multiple doses, but still just a few doses. These aren't long-term trials. We want to see what those most common drug side effects are. We want to make sure that those most common side effects are not very serious, to allow then the product to continue through the phases of development. In addition to safety, we're able to see where the drug gets to. Depends maybe on whether this is something that is absorbed throughout the body, like an oral product or an injected product, or is this having a localized effect? But we want to make sure that the drug's getting to the parts of the body it needs to have its effect. Want to see how long it's there. All of that is very important, particularly for understanding whether you have the right dose. So once we have this information, and again, we determine that's reasonably safe to proceed with certain dose or doses, we can then move into the next phase, which is phase 2 of clinical development. Phase 2 clinical trials are, as you'll see here, there's a trend, are a little bit bigger and a little bit longer. The idea here is we're starting to want to see if we have kind of proof of concept. Do we have early evidence that the drug is working? And so phase 2 trials will always be in individuals with the condition. And then we're looking to see if there's early markers or maybe early clinical signs and symptoms to see if they're improving, if the drug is working in people. Sometimes phase 2 studies will have a comparator arm. The most common is called a placebo control. This is essentially what you might have heard referred to as like the sugar pill. This allows us to, make it so both the patients and the study doctors don't know whether people are on drug or on the sugar pill, so to speak. So that way there's no bias in terms of the study outcomes, and what can we really attribute to the drug. Because you may have also heard that there's something called a placebo effect, where people in clinical trials tend to improve and do better just from being in a clinical trial, even without getting the investigational drug. So we're able to look and see about that, whether there's that early sign proof of concept of drug benefit. And of course, now as we have more people taking the drug and they're taking it longer now, we can look for short-term side effects and other safety issues. The more people you expose and the longer, the more likely you're going to start to see some of those things that maybe aren't those most common side effects, but slightly more uncommon ones. If we have a positive kind of benefit risk balance here that supports that we have a, one or two, maybe at this point, doses that could be really effective for patients and have reasonable safety, we then proceed to phase 3. Phase 3 clinical trials, these sometimes are called different names or terms. These might be how they're kind of talked about or reported about. Sometimes they're called pivotal studies. Sometimes they're called registration studies. But these are the studies that are intended to really demonstrate the drug's benefit. And so these are larger scale. They're almost always either placebo controlled or some other form of control. So that way we can really see the drug effect relative to a control group. Because these are bigger and larger studies, we can start to now see not only the initial drug effect, but whether that drug effect continues to grow over time. Does it stabilize, or maybe does it wear off? We can look, because we have larger populations enrolling in the study, a larger number of people in the study. We can look to individual subpopulations and say, is this drug, have different effects either on the safety or the benefit side, depending on, the severity of the condition people had coming into the study, maybe different ages or at different ethnicities. We really can start to look across different subpopulations to see if there's any differences in effect. And we may still be looking at multiple dosages at this time. In addition to establishing the drug's benefit, we, of course, are still looking at safety. And because these are the longest studies and the largest, this is really giving us a lot of safety information, including some of the longest term information we'll have pre-approval. And we'll also, as these phases of trials progress, be including a broader, more generalizable patient population. Usually start with very narrow in phase 1 and 2, but you want to make sure that you're seeing the benefit in a somewhat broader population by phase 3, and that can include then looking at drug-drug interactions of other drugs that are commonly used in the patient population. Now, FDA can either require 2 phase 3 trials, but in more rare conditions, they can allow for a single study with supportive evidence. And that largely is based off of FDA's understanding of how significant the disease is impacting in patients' lives, in other words, how serious it is, as well as how great the unmet medical need is. And so that already right off the bat is something that makes this EL-PFDD meeting really important to help inform how rapid, how expedited should, development be versus taking this traditional approach, because FDA also has the ability to allow phase 1 and 2 studies to be combined, or maybe phase 2 and 3 studies to be combined. But that kind of expedited development, FDA reserves for situations where they understand that there's a urgent, serious need for new treatments. So when all of this is said and done and all that information is collected, Then the drug developer takes that information to FDA. The goal is to put all of that information and submit it to FDA in what's called a new drug application, or NDA, or biologics license application, or BLA. Really just depends on what type of molecule it is, but they really are equivalent. So before a company actually puts all the information together and formally submits it, they have a meeting with FDA called a pre-NDA or a pre-BLA meeting. In this meeting, they're sharing often what is high level or top line, the results of those phase 3, either clinical trial or clinical trials. They're discussing how they analyze the data. And the goal is to try to uncover any major issues. You want to know, are there any gaps that FDA sees that need to be filled before they would be able to review an NDA or BLA submission? And the idea is you want to figure that out first so you can do that rather than submitting your NDA or BLA only to find out later that the application can't be reviewed or approved. So the NDA and BLA, this is the application that, if approved, allows the company to then market and sell the product. It allows doctors and other prescribers to prescribe the drug to patients. And that application includes everything we talked about, all of the preclinical and all phases of clinical trial data. So it's a huge amount of information that FDA is then reviewing. And FDA's first job when they get that is to determine if it's a complete application and to assign a review team. If an application is not complete or is inadequate in some way, they actually refuse to file it. So it kind of stops it, kicks it out. But assuming that the NDA or BLA is accepted by FDA, then they go and they assess those three things we talked about earlier. What is the drug's effectiveness in the patient population studied? What's the safety profile? And do the benefits that they see outweigh the risks of the drug? And then the third prong, are the manufacturing methods now presumably to produce a lot more of the drug, not just what was needed for clinical trials, but, to be able to keep up with the demand of prescriptions, is that larger scale manufacturing, do they have their manufacturing, kind of controlled and high quality? While FDA is conducting this review, they do have, you might have heard of this, they have the ability to convene advisory committees. These are external panels of experts and will include a patient or caregiver representative to be asked questions by FDA and hear a review of the data, both from the company and from the FDA perspectives, and ultimately vote. You often will see the media pick up and talk about the vote, but the vote itself isn't binding to FDA. It's really all of the input and the discussion that helps FDA the most, because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's still FDA's decision of whether to approve or not. If a drug's approved, the job of FDA and the drug developer, the drug company, doesn't stop there. They have to continuously do surveillance work about the drug safety. Once the drug goes out into the real world, a lot more people and different, people with different other, maybe comorbidities or that are on other drugs will take it that weren't in clinical trials. And so we learn a lot more about the drugs, and in particular safety profile, when it's out there in the real world. And so, as new safety information emerges, that has to be reported to FDA, and ultimately it's up to FDA to ensure that the benefits of drugs continue to outweigh their risks. So we just spent a lot of time talking about the drug development process, which is, we largely are talking about what drug developers are doing and the different clinical trials and other development work that they are sponsoring, that they're running with study doctors. So what's FDA's role in all of that? Well, I think it's important to know that FDA is not actually developing drugs. That's researchers, pharmaceutical companies, even nonprofit groups sometimes take this on by either funding the research or maybe even bringing it in-house. FDA, they're not even testing the drugs. They're not running the trials. Their staff are not on site during those trials. again, it's the researchers that are conducting trials, but those study plans, those study protocols have to be submitted to FDA ahead of time. And so FDA is providing oversight and ensuring safety in addition to institutional review boards or IRBs. But FDA can't dictate for a drug company what studies to do. They're just reviewing the studies that the companies are proposing and giving them feedback and advice on that. You might also be wondering, well, what is FDA's role when drugs get approved? FDA does not have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So that means they can't, while they're regulating what the drug companies are doing in terms of developing the drug and then eventually marketing it. So, those ads you see on TV or in magazines, or, what companies maybe are saying to doctors, that's what FDA regulates. Doctors, however, are not regulated by FDA. Their prescribing is done according to standard of care, kind of for medical practice. And they're, because of that, allowed to use FDA-approved drugs for ways that aren't FDA approved. And this is known as off-label use. So FDA does not regulate that off-label use. Also, FDA does not regulate the price of medicine. So when FDA is approving a drug, they're considering the benefits of the drug compared to the safety risks. They're not assessing the cost benefit of the drug. That's what payers or insurers do. So FDA, they're not looking at what the price of the drug might be. They don't have that information. And even if they did, their mandate does not allow them to take that into consideration. So as you think about FDA as your audience, you're really trying to influence them in terms of understanding your condition to inform that benefit risk decision, not issues around the healthcare system or access through the insurance system. My last two slides talked about what FDA really doesn't do. So let me just say something before I wrap things up here about what FDA's role actually is in promoting drug development. So FDA, their mission is not only to protect the public health, but also to promote it. FDA reviewers, as you might imagine, they work on they see every drug that's in development in a particular disease space. And they see a lot of not only what works, but doesn't work. And so they use that information, and companies come and meet with FDA before they submit their study plans to get technical feedback. And FDA gives them advice and helps them then in designing those clinical trials. I could have showed you on that little diagram with the different phases of drug development. I could have dropped little arrows down along the way, showing all the different places where FDA and companies meet. And so it really is happening throughout all of those stages of development, sharing of data to help then inform the design of the next trials and also tap into FDA's deep expertise. So I know we covered a lot of information and it was at a fairly high level, but if you are interested in more about FDA and their regulation of medical products, FDA has a website that's listed here, fda.gov//for patients, where you can find out more information directly from FDA about how it does this work. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah, who's going to tell you a little bit about where your voice fits into this process and give you more details about the EL-PFDD meeting itself. Sarah?
Thanks so much, James. So what is the purpose of this patient-focused drug development meeting? Next slide. So, the FDA had wanted to develop a more systematic way of gathering patient perspectives about different diseases and conditions and the available treatment options for those diseases and conditions. So they came up with this whole idea of having one-day-long meetings called patient-focused drug development meetings, or PFDDs, where they would meet with patients and caregivers and listen and learn from them and spend the entire day learning about their conditions. And so this kind of information really helps inform FDA's understanding of the context when they conduct a benefit risk assessment for new potential therapies. And patient input really helps the FDA during drug development, as well as during the review of an application for a new therapy, which is the final step in the drug development process that James just mentioned. Next slide. So I just mentioned something called a benefit risk assessment. And this is a formal assessment that's done by the FDA for every drug that they review during the review and approval process. And the purpose of it is to decide whether the benefits of the new treatment outweigh the potential risks or the potential side effects of the new therapy or the condition it's intended to treat. So in order to understand this, FDA needs to analyze what the disease or condition is and what current treatment options are available to people living with that condition. And this kind of helps them understand the current state of things. And then as far as the benefits of the treatment and the potential risks, this is the data that they review from clinical trials. And so when a company that's developing a new therapy submits all of their data in its marketing application to the FDA evaluates the clinical studies and looks at what were the side effects of this new treatment. And so these first two things in these bullets, the analysis of the condition and the current treatment options, that's where this PFDD meeting, that's really going to benefit and help the FDA when it evaluates a marketing application for a new therapy for dysphagia. Next slide, please. So now more about our externally led meeting. And the reason it's called externally led is because it's external to the FDA. You know, we are planning it, the foundation is planning it outside of the FDA. The FDA has been supporting us to develop the meeting. But it's our meeting, and FDA is attending to listen to all of you. And so this meeting is going to be a framework for discussing questions that came from the FDA's benefit risk framework that I just described, and it represents important considerations in FDA's decision making. So we reviewed past PFDD meetings and other disease area questions, and we've tailored the agenda and panel questions specifically for this meeting to try to communicate the most important information related to dysphagia. And FDA has emphasized to us that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. So that's why we're meeting with you today to try and get you excited about it. Next slide. And so one thing we always hear is what's going to come out of this meeting. And well, at the end of the day, we do have a medical writer that's going to write everything that happens at the meeting into a report called the Voice of the Patient Report. And this is the summary of the patient and caregiver and audience testimony, the polling that we're going to do, as well as your submitted written comments. And this document then becomes a key communication to the FDA review staff, as well as drug developers or really anyone interested in dysphagia about what is most important in a treatment to patients with dysphagia and their caregivers. And like we had mentioned, FDA really wants this information. It informs them about ways that meaningful treatments for dysphagia can be developed. Next slide. So now, how do you actually participate in the meeting? So the meeting is for dysphagia patients and caregivers, FDA staff. We hope that pharma and biotech companies will come, and since it is a public meeting, anyone interested in learning about dysphagia can attend. The meeting will take place on June 10th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is a virtual meeting, so folks can attend anywhere where they can get the internet, whether you're in the US or abroad. It is an interactive live stream, and the link at the bottom of the slide is how you will access and register for the meeting. Next slide. So just to go over the agenda on the day of the meeting on June 10th, first, there is going to be a welcome and some introductory comments from the patient organization planning team, as well as the FDA. Then we will hear some clinical background by a dysphagia expert. This will be followed by interactive discussions that are going to be divided into two topics. In the morning, we're going to ask and focus on how dysphagia symptoms affect your life. So what symptoms do you have? Which ones affect you the most? We will take a lunch break, and when we come back, we are going to shift gears and talk about how do you manage symptoms of dysphagia and what are your current approaches and current treatments. And if there was going to be a new treatment for dysphagia, what would you like to see? Some of the topics will include pre-recorded patient panels, and they'll include polling questions and a moderated discussion with the audience, who is you. And so at the end of the day, we will have a summary of the meeting followed by closing comments. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of some of the discussion questions, there will be time during the meeting where we're going to ask you to pick up your phone and call in. And the call-in number will be at the top of the screen during the meeting. And some of the questions for the first topic are of all the symptoms of dysphagia, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on you or your loved one's life? How does dysphagia affect you or your loved one on best and worst days, and describe those days? And then, are there specific activities that are important to you that you or your loved one can't do at all or as fully as you would like because of having dysphagia? Next slide. And to continue, some other questions that might be asked are, have your or your loved one's symptoms changed over time, and how has the ability to cope with those symptoms changed over time? When we talk about symptoms, we want to know about physical symptoms as well as psychological and emotional symptoms. And then, what do you fear the most as you or your loved one gets older? What do you worry about? How your condition might change, and what frustrates you the most about having this condition, especially over the long term. Next slide. So as I said in the afternoon, we're kind of shift gears to talking about the challenges of treating dysphagia. So some of the discussion questions are going to be, what are you currently doing to manage dysphagia symptoms? So what medications are you using, or other treatments? We want to even know, things like, are you using any non-drug treatment or interventions, such as physical therapy or electrical stimulation, or things that aren't a typical drug treatment? How well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of dysphagia? And then we also want to hear about the downside. So what are the most significant side effects to your current treatments or interventions, and how do they affect your or your loved one's daily life? We want to hear about this because sometimes, even though there is a treatment available, it doesn't mean that it's curative or that it's really helping in a big way. And then finally, short of a complete cure, which of course is what everyone would like to see, what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for dysphagia? So as you know, we've got drug companies listening and the FDA. We really want to hear from you about what you would like in a new treatment. Next slide. So our discussion format on the day of the meeting, as I said, there will be a panel of patients and caregivers for each of the topics. We have 5 people in the morning and 5 people in the afternoon session that have pre-recorded statements. The purpose of these statements is to really set the foundation for the broader audience discussion that will follow. These panelists were pre-selected to reflect a range of experiences with dysphagia, and then after we hear from them, patients and caregivers that are attending online and virtually will have a chance to answer polling questions. And so the polling questions can be accessed and completed on your cell phone, on your tablet, or your computer. And there will be instructions on the day of the meeting on how to get those questions to pop up on your device. And we only want people to participate in the polling that either have dysphagia or they are a caregiver or relative of someone with dysphagia. And then after we do some polling, we are going to have a live discussion with the audience. We are going to have a few people that will be live on the Zoom call. And then, like I mentioned earlier, there will also be a call-in number where you can call in to share your experiences. Our moderator for the meeting will be James, who you heard from earlier. He is going to ask questions and invite you to submit responses either in writing or preferably calling in live to the meeting, like a talk show. So really the emphasis is that we want to hear from as many of you as we can, both during the meeting and in written comments after the meeting. Next slide. So some tips on how to participate effectively on the day of the meeting. Kind of keep in the back of your mind what James had said about FDA's role, as well as the purpose of the meeting. You know, we're not going to talk about high insurance costs or high prices of medicine because FDA doesn't regulate any of those things. We'd like, maybe review some of the discussion questions in advance, which are going to be posted on the website where you register. And if you have something important to share, try to relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question that we're talking about. And then pick up your phone and call in or submit a written comment. And please know that it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that has already been voiced by someone that's similar to your own. We really want to establish that, this is something that really impacts people's lives with dysphagia. And so even if something's repetitive, that must just mean it's really, really important. We just ask that if you do reiterate something that someone has already said, just give it a personal or unique perspective. And try to keep your comments concise and focused. We want to hear from as many voices as possible about this very emotional topic. And please know that you can always send in additional written comments after the meeting is over. And those comments that you send in will make their way into the Voice of the Patient report. Next slide. Participate in the meeting by webcast. And we want you to participate in the polling, call in with comments, or provide written comments if you're more comfortable doing that. You can pre-register for the meeting right now at the URL on this slide. Comments with answers to the questions can be submitted prior to the meeting right now also. And as I said, up to 30 days after the meeting. And we will put those in the Voice of the Patient report that gets submitted to the FDA. Next slide. And so in summary, this is really your opportunity as a community to be a part of the FDA drug development process and to move the process forward in a meaningful way for the dysphagia community. Please know that each and every one of you can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial designs, as well as drug development for new treatments for dysphagia. It is so incredibly important for your collective voices to be heard, not only at the beginning of the development process, but really throughout the process to try to help companies design trials that better meet your needs, as well as to help the FDA assess the risks and benefits of a potential treatment with a fuller understanding of the impact of dysphagia and really what the lived experience is and what patient and caregivers' perspectives are. So please, I hope you join us and help us get the word out to help make a difference for your community. We have a few minutes left, so we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A balloon at the bottom of your screen. It can be about anything James covered about the drug development process or about the PFDD meeting itself. Thank you.
Right. James and Sarah, thank you so much for explaining all the details about this meeting to our community. We have members here today that are from industry, that are from research. We have several patients and caregivers joining us as well, along with speech pathologists that treat this community. So thank you for sharing that. We're glad that everybody is here. I do have a few questions that I would love to ask you. My first one here for James. Dysphagia is really more of a symptom than it is a disease in itself, so a condition. Um, Many people in our community are not used to hearing drugs or medications being used to treat this, but rather devices or strategies to compensate for this. Is that still something that the FDA wants to hear about?
Yes, absolutely. So when we're talking about your experiences, and I think as Sarah described it, in the morning, in the first half of the meeting, you'll be focused on your experiences with the symptoms of dysphagia and how that impacts your daily life. But in the afternoon, we want to hear about your approaches to quote unquote treating dysphagia. And when we say that, we really are casting the widest net imaginable. So not only would it be, a drug, including investigational drugs. If you have been in a clinical trial, that's totally fair game to share your experiences with that. But it's also medical devices. It's also, speech language, therapy. But it's also, things that you might, use or do, strategies for eating, and to make swallowing more comfortable. Things that you just might, kind of use and try, in day-to-day life. It can even be lifestyle modifications. It doesn't even have to be an intervention as we would think of it. If there's a way that you have to approach, aspects of your life and the activities that you do in your life, hearing about that can be valuable. Hearing what is helpful, even if it's only helpful in limited ways, is extremely valuable, because sometimes things that only help in a limited way do have a broad range of benefits in terms of your quality of life, the things that you can get out and do and experience that maybe without something that helped even in that small way would be a lot harder. And then, of course, if there's things that haven't helped or helped, maybe some things that have really been transformational, the whole gambit is fair game. But we'll also necessarily, in hearing about that, be hearing about all of the unmet needs that exist as well. So don't think that just because you're talking about something that's helped, that it's undermining helping teach FDA about the unmet need. Trust me, that is not the case. They'll have spent the entire morning hearing about the magnitude of unmet need, and then they're going to be hearing about maybe much smaller incremental things that might be helping a little bit in the afternoon.
Yeah. This next question here asks, what types of dysphagia are you looking for? Dysphagia is very broad. It can affect anywhere from, before food even enters the mouth, all the way through the esophagus into the stomach. We are looking for anybody who is an adult, 18 or over, that has trouble swallowing. It could be something that you've had since birth. It could be something that's acquired. It can be something that's progressive. It can be just esophageal dysphagia. It can be just oral dysphagia. It can be related to any sort of underlying diagnosis. So really, any adult is welcome to join, any caregiver of an adult that's impacted by a swallowing disorder. If your swallowing disorder has gone away, if you've had treatment and it's improved, you can still join us to share those experiences of what it was like during that time. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that's right.
Okay, excellent. I have a comment here from somebody who's a speech language pathologist and also an advocate for patients with head and neck cancer, commenting that using quality of life metrics is so important. So when doing this research, we just don't want to undermine the impact of quality of life on these patients where we know that treatment for things like head and neck cancer have come quite a long way, but at what cost to survival? And I think she's commenting that people are surviving the treatments for these cancers, but the impact on their quality of life can be devastating at times. So I was just reading that, but using,
Well,
go ahead.
no, I think that's a great comment. And while the meeting itself, we're not going to be, asking, patients and caregivers to weigh in on any particular quality of life tool or symptom measure. Absolutely, FDA and drug developers are listening with that in mind. They're listening, what are the things that are most troubling patients? in their lives? What aspects? And then they're going to start noodling in their head. Well, are we measuring those in clinical trials? If we, not only the most, kind of, proximal, like physiologic measures, but, how are we actually measuring how a patient would describe what they're experiencing, not only directly, but a little bit downstream too, in terms of impacts, in terms of like activities in daily life, even. And then even beyond that, not only just what are the right things to measure, this community is going to be teaching FDA and drug developers about how it's experienced from day to day, week to month, over the course of years. And so that also helps in saying, well, what tools are the right tools to actually go about assessing it in the way that people really experiencing it. So it's a well taken point, and know that that is actually something that can help be supported by this type of meeting.
Thank you. Question. You had mentioned, Sarah and James, that you have hosted over 70 of these types of meetings. Can you give an example, a real world example of the impact of these meetings from a prior one that you've hosted?
Sure. So what I'll say is, seeing the direct impacts often is a little bit more difficult than you would hope. You'd hope that you have a meeting and tomorrow there's a new approved drug. The development process, as we talked about it, is today is a long process, and there's a lot of things that can drive successes and failures that are beyond kind of the impacts of this type of meeting. But we have seen early in development, these meetings completely change how FDA thinks about endpoints. We have seen diseases that where clinical trials were not capturing what patients said was the most important thing, and because of this type of meeting, FDA actually completely changed the advice it was giving companies, and now made that hallmark symptom of the disease the primary endpoint. We've seen late in development where the FDA was made, in one case that comes to mind, FDA was considering a biomarker based approval. So it would take a long, long time to follow and see whether the drug would actually benefit patients in a way that you would affects how you feel or how you function in daily life. And so sometimes FDA has the ability to approve based off of something they measure in the blood, or imaging, a biomarker. That's kind of predicts whether or not the drug will actually have a clinical benefit. Of course, that has to be confirmed once the drug's on the market. But doing that raises uncertainty. Is that something that really, do patients want to have more certainty about whether the drug has that clinical benefit, or will they take on greater uncertainty to have the opportunity to try and the drug and talk to the drug, maybe have it prescribed by their doctor sooner? And so, because FDA appreciated the journey that patients were going on and the urgency of what they were experiencing, they justified the approval based off of that surrogate biomarker, saying, we appreciate that if we required a whole nother trial to see if the long clinical benefits were to come to fruition, there's a lot of patients that would suffer a lot in the meantime. So those are just a kind of a couple of the types of examples. What I suggest the community does is, after this meeting, your advocates, who you've seen some of them here today, keep talking to the drug companies, and you keep talking to the drug companies. They come to patient meetings and the like, and get a sense of how their interactions with FDA are going. And if you see FDA people out at public meetings, talk to them. And it's kind of more qualitative, but you hopefully will start to hear and see the discussion be anchored in, well, we heard this from patients, and therefore we're thinking about doing things in Y way.
Well, thanks for sharing that. We have a few questions here from people with dysphagia. I want to start with this one. It's a survivor of tongue cancer who is on a liquid diet for life, who feels like they really don't know any solutions for this. and don't feel like they can add anything to this conversation. And I would say you're exactly the type of person we want to join this meeting. Because you're lacking in treatment options, even if you can't even imagine what those would look like, we want you to share your story. And also, if communication is something that's difficult or challenging, there are ways to participate in this meeting, even if you can't say out loud what it is you would like the FDA to hear. So you can enter your comments early. There's a portal on our website for that. I'll share more information in a follow-up email with everyone that's on this call. You can join by taking the polling questions during the live meeting. You can enter your comments the day of the meeting as well. So don't let communication be a barrier to participating in this. You can also have a representative with you. So if you have a caregiver or a friend with you, they can call in on your behalf to speak if you want to phone call in the day of the meeting. And then another question here from a person living with esophageal dysphagia. Let me scroll up. It came in early. Just wondering if you're aware of any new drugs that are being evaluated right now for esophageal dysmotility. And I don't know if we would have the right answer to that, James and Sarah. I don't think you. Please feel free to
You know,
jump
what
in
I
if
will
you know.
what I will say is, that's kind of beyond, our area of expertise, but we are, for the meeting, to ensure the entire audience kind of knows what's happening, are going to have a couple of clinical presentations, one which is really going to be focused on, what is already out there and available, but what's in the pipeline. So that will be part of the meeting day.
Excellent. Thank you. Going down here, yes, the file, the QR code goes to apply as a speaker. I will update that on our website, and I will send out a link so that you can submit early comments and make sure everything is updated on the website after this. That's also where we will put the recording for this webinar as well if you want to go back to review anything. Let me just scroll through here, Sarah and James, if you've had a chance to read through some of these, feel free to answer any, and I'm just going to catch up on some of the comments coming in here.
Yeah, I saw one that was a follow-up question about FDA regulating the practice of medicine, and if it's not FDA, who's providing that oversight. So it's kind of complex. It's basically a state by state kind of situation where, a mixture of medical malpractice and state medical boards and licensure requirements provide that type of oversight. So it's not really true that doctors can use drugs off-label for anything. They have to use drugs within the standard of care. So usually that's following their medical society's guidelines, what maybe is supported by the literature, studies that weren't necessarily done to support FDA approval, but were done and published on. So there are checks and balances. It's just not the FDA.
Thank you. I have another comment here from somebody who is a caregiver for their brother, and unfortunately he's passed away, and we're sorry to hear that. We would still love for you to be involved in this meeting, having your perspective as a caregiver, and it sounds like you experienced some negative things during your time while you were caring for your family. We would love to hear your experiences, so please feel free to join us for that. Another question here about whether there will be a calendar invitation. Yes, we will send you a calendar invitation for this. Because it's a live broad stream, it's not like a webinar that you would sign up for and get a link for. You go to the website the day of and it will be streaming live. So it'll look a little different to what you might expect or like what you received for today's webinar, if that makes sense. Some more comments coming in from people that are joining us that have trouble with their swallowing. I can see people are responding to that too, to share their experiences here. Join us the day of too. Share that with everybody that's joining in our big meeting here. If I missed anything.
I did see one. It was kind of a comment around, kind of concerns around side effects and sometimes really brutal side effects of drugs that are approved. And so what I would say is that is within this, when we get into that afternoon treatment discussion, we want to understand not only what your experiences are of things that have helped, but if you have experienced side effects of therapies or other interventions for dysphagia, and that has had a negative impact on your life, we need and want to hear about that. And similarly, when we get into discussions about future treatments, it's not just what are you looking for in terms of treatment benefit outcomes, but are there things that are deal breakers for you on the risk side? And so hearing your individualized personal perspective, everyone's going to have a little bit of a different risk tolerance. Everyone has different treatment goals. And the goal is to, by hearing from as many people as possible, stitch together, kind of a range of outcomes, both in terms of benefits and risks. So it helps calibrate, what Sarah had talked about in that benefit risk framework. We really want to calibrate it for FDA rather than them guessing, essentially.
James. Sarah and James, thank you. I think we'll pause here to be mindful of everybody's time, but I appreciate you answering our questions and sharing more about this meeting. I will send a follow-up email to everybody who joined us today. And with that, thank you for joining us. We really hope to see you on June 10th. You can scan this QR code. It will take you to this website link here that has more information about the upcoming meeting, and we will keep that updated. But again, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.